All right, the time has come. I'm going to review everybody's forehands. I've even got my, let's see here. I've got my analytical drawing tools ready. So it's going to get real serious here. Okay, so start things off. What is the deal with a forehand? Well, unfortunately, with the footage that I captured, uh, we didn't get footage of kind of actually reacting to a real incoming ball. So step number one is kind of unavailable to us. So we're just going to really analyze the rest of the things here. The backswing, the start of the forward motion, the point of contact with the ball, and then the follow through. Fun fact, backswing, all one word. But what's the antonym for backswing? I don't know. Apparently forward swing is not all one word. All right. So the backswing, forward swing, point of contact, follow through, they all can be like uh, examined into different parts, but a lot of times there's going to be some commonalities. So like the feet are important in a bunch of different steps. The the shoulders are going to be important in a bunch of different steps. Well, okay, two steps. And then the racket height is kind of a thing, kind of a trend that we need to examine, so on and so forth. Let me get the video to loop only on the slow motion part here. All right. So starting out with the backswing, probably the biggest issue, and keep in mind the footage was taken before people warmed up and before Albert and I gave our free coaching advice. So this is like very awkward practice swinging. But the deal here is in the beginning, there's a lot of just taking the racket straight back and then having the racket come straight forward in the pretty much the exact same line, which is no bueno. So instead of taking the racket kind of like the backswing, basically, you don't want it to be just the reverse of the forward swing. If we look at Albert, his backswing loops up. Maybe it loops up a little bit too far, and then it loops pretty far behind him, and then it goes, the forward swing is pretty low. So it's way more loopy, and that's it's a little extreme, but that's generally what you want. And then pretty much everybody has the right stance where everybody's in the closed stance already. So before, when I was talking about how we don't really have step one in the footage, what I mean by that is this is the step that gets you into the correct stance, but in the footage, everybody's already in the correct stance where you've got your um, your front foot and your back foot are kind of aligned with the camera, and your body is basically facing to your right. Okay, so everybody's got the closed stance. Everybody's generally looking over their left shoulder, which is good. Um, okay, so what do you do during the backswing with your non-dominant hand? Well, you don't want to just like have it doing nothing, which if we go back, then we see. Actually, let me bring it back a little bit more. We see a lot of the uh, left arm just kind of being down with Wenpei and Sean. But with Albert, his left arm is actually kind of up. It doesn't really need to be that high up, but it's kind of making sure it's not going to be in the way. And ideally, I would say, especially for beginners, you want that left arm to be aiming at the ball. You basically take your left hand and just aim it at the incoming ball. And that'll help with your upper body rotation. All right, moving on. Forward swing. So actually everybody, I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but everybody is pretty much stepping forward with their front foot kind of right before they initiate the swing, which is the correct thing to do. And then as the racket starts swinging forward, you'll notice that Albert's racket is kind of lagging behind his arm, whereas Sean's racket is very much lined up with his arm. And part of that is just because Sean didn't really know how to grip the racket to begin with. So he's got an awkward Eastern grip, whereas Albert's got what's called the semi-Western grip, and that allows him to have this sort of racket lag, if you will. And everybody generally goes low with their swing, which is good. But let's see what happens next. So at the point of contact, which for Sean, this frame of the video is point of contact, where the racket face is facing the camera. And one thing to note here is this is where it becomes very obvious that he's got the not optimal grip. And if you were to compare this to Albert, we can kind of think of Sean is like complete beginner, Wenpei is advanced beginner, Albert is intermediate. If we look at Albert's grip, you see a ton of his fingers wrapping around that racket handle. And that's just because he has a different grip style, and that's generally the grip style that you want to emulate. So, in other words, you want semi-Western, you don't want Eastern. Okay, and then when it comes to where your racket is in terms of height, where the racket is, I'm seeing a lot of knee height rackets. Wenpei actually has waist height, which I think since we're all not tall, I would say waist height is generally preferable rather than knee height. Now, obviously, it's going to depend, but I think for our height, the strike zone, if you will, the optimal zone is going to be more so at the waist level. All right. And then lastly, as you're making contact with the ball, you want to kind of have some sort of upwards swiping motion with the racket. Now this becomes more obvious when we look at the follow through. So if I play the video, we follow through, you can see kind of in this motion, we've got Sean just kind of, his racket just sort of swipes, or not swipe, it just sort of slaps upward. And then Wenpei, after she makes point of contact, kind of similar. There's a little bit more of an arc, upwards arc, which is what we want to help generate some spin. And then if we look at Albert, what has he got? Right around point of contact, he's got way more arc. So it's a little bit hard to see, but that's kind of that was the swiping motion that I was talking about here. All right. So with the follow through, what does the proper follow through look like? Let's just skip to the end here. So if we look at the if we look at the end, towards the end of the recording, then we have three very different kind of end poses, if you will. We've got Albert, who the textbook style, he's looking over his right shoulder. He's got the back foot with the heel lifted up, and his toes are kind of dragging along the ground. It's hard to tell from this frame. I'll change frames later, but his racket face is pointing out to his left. And what else is there? Oh, and then his left arm has gone up to catch the racket. Oh yeah, and his racket is kind of over his what would this be? His left shoulder. Yeah. So that's all the kind of textbook things to do. On the other hand, we see Sean where his shoulders, both of his shoulders are very visible to the camera. He's not looking over his right shoulder. So you want to be starting your swing looking over your non-dominant shoulder, and then you want to end looking over your dominant shoulder, because that means that you've done like a nice 180 upper body twist, and that twist gives you a lot of power with very little effort. On the other hand, we've got Wenpei here, and she has done the twist, upper body twist, but then that twist also included her legs. So what used to be her back leg is now actually her front leg, which is kind of funny. So if you look at back leg, but then as she swings, it is now in front. Also, another funny thing that I forgot to mention about Wenpei is this kind of uncertainty about using two hands versus one hand for this forehand motion. So she's using her non-dominant hand to catch the racket way too early. And that's just a little problematic because it makes the follow through a little bit harder. Okay. So I didn't really mention why you want your racket face to be ending by pointing to your left. You don't want it pointing downwards the way Sean and Wenpei are doing here. You want it pointing to your left. And the reason is because if it's pointing to the left, that means you've done the correct motion for generating spin on the ball by swiping on the ball. So remember, how does Albert generate spin on the ball? He has a swiping motion with the racket after the point of contact. All right. So that was kind of the super analytical take, but we can kind of summarize things in a way that might be a little bit easier to remember. So at the start, you've got closed stance, which, for the most part, everybody has the closed stance. Like you can see when the backswing is done and you're ready to start swinging forward, everybody's got roughly the same stance. That's decently nice. The other thing is, but the main thing I should say is that everybody can improve on is how they take the racket back. So instead of doing a reverse forward swing, where you have to fight the momentum of your backswing to start the forward swing, you want to do more of a slightly loopy motion, so then you're not fighting your own momentum. And then also, you don't want that left arm to just sort of be doing nothing. You want it to actually be upright a little bit, kind of aiming towards the ball, getting it away from your body. That way it's not kind of awkwardly hanging around. When we get towards the point of contact with the ball, remember that there's some lag with the racket and the arm. So in this frame, it's particularly obvious that Albert's racket is not in line with his arm. It's not like a straight line, one continuous long arm. Instead, it's broken out into like Albert's arm and then the racket. All right, and then we want to make contact with the ball roughly around waist height, and we want the swiping motion where as we make contact with the ball, we want the racket to kind of swipe upwards on the ball. So rather than just focusing on swinging through the ball, you want some upwards motion in order to get spin generated. If you look at Sean's swing, it's just swinging through the ball. So it's all about just pushing the ball forward. So you don't get any spin that way. And then lastly, as you follow through, look at Albert's follow through. Like his upper body basically does a nice twisting motion as he follows through. So in the beginning, this is Albert, where he's looking over his left shoulder. Well, if he were looking at the camera, he'd be looking over his left shoulder. And then towards the end, we get some nice upper body twist, and now he's looking over his right shoulder. And his racket is also pretty high up because the motion of kind of bringing the racket from a position that it got pretty darn low, right? Like it got this low earlier. And then if we follow through, then we see the racket goes pretty darn high with the follow through. All right, I know that's kind of a lot of information, but perhaps the easiest way to think of it is in three parts here. The footwork, just keep in mind that you generally want the what we call the closed stance, where your body is facing to your right. And then when you end, or sorry, and then also as you start the forward swing, you want to step forward with, you want to step forward with your front foot. And then as you end, your back foot has the heel lifting off and the toe dragging along the court. That's kind of the footwork aspect. So we did that. If we look at low to high, what does that mean? Low to high is in reference to the racket swing. So at some point, before the point of contact, the racket needs to be pretty darn low, like below the ball, below the height of the ball when you make contact with the ball. And then you want to end up really high. And once again, this is to help with your kind of upwards swiping, spinning on the ball, or creating spin on the ball. And then the final thing is shoulder to shoulder, which refers to, in the beginning, looking over one shoulder. In the end, you're looking over the opposite shoulder. So you start with one shoulder, your upper body rotates all the way to the other shoulder. And that's a good way to, that's how I always remind myself to like get more power on the ball, is with this shoulder to shoulder thing. Especially when you first start out, maybe a good way to think about it is like, okay, I want my arm to be focused on the low to high motion in order to generate spin, and I want my upper body twisting from one shoulder to the next in order to generate power. Alrighty. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Now that said, Albert's not perfect, so he's our model here for the textbook forehand. But there are a couple of things that I thought he could do a little bit better. So first of all, this backswing, the racket is very high up. I don't think it needs to be this high up at all. In fact, I would say it should be somewhere around like torso height, not above his head. And then we couldn't really talk about the unit turn because it's not really, we didn't capture footage for what happened before the backswing because we're not reacting to a real incoming ball. So that's unfortunate. But moving on. Point of contact for Albert looks extremely low, considering that we're not tall like the pros are. Then I would say we generally want the point of contact to be a little bit higher. And, you know, if you need to, then bend your legs at the knees in order to get low enough to have the ball be level with your waist when you are making contact with the ball. And then, despite me praising Albert's shoulder to shoulder follow through, I still think he could rotate a little bit further, in my opinion, because I think ideally his shoulder, his right shoulder, or his upper body would have rotated so much that we wouldn't really be able to see any remnants of his left shoulder from the perspective of the camera. So kind of like how in the beginning, if you look at the beginning here, his shoulders are aligned with the camera, so you can't really see his back. You only see his forward shoulder, you don't see the back shoulder at all. When he follows through, you see a forward shoulder, and you can kind of see that the back shoulder is not 100% aligned. Now, that's nitpicky, so not a huge deal. Anyway, I'll make a separate video where I compare Albert's technique to my technique, which is quote unquote the modern men's tennis forehand. Whereas what Albert's doing is what I was taught when I first started learning tennis, which is kind of like the more traditional technique. And that's the technique that every noob should pursue because it's much more approachable and it's still really effective.